Hey everyone, this is a chapter from Charul Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, third period, 1930 to 1941, Part 1, The Dominated. This is the first part. This is from the first part of the book, which is titled "The Peasantry Expropriated." The first chapter is titled "The quote Socialist Transformation of Agriculture," end quote, and the class struggles. So here we go. It looks like there's an introduction to the part that this chapter's from before the chapter actually starts. It's only a couple paragraphs. So, Part 1, The Peasantry Expropriated. For most of the 1920s, Soviet agriculture remained mainly, quote, private. In 1927, quote, individual peasant farms provided 92.4% of the marketed grain production. The sovkhozes, state farms, 5.7%. The kolkhozes, quote, collective farms, 1.9%. In 1928, these two latter types of farm had less than 3% of the sown land and were worked by a still smaller proportion of the active population. The concept then dominant of the NEP had led the party and state to avoid giving real help to peasants wishing to adopt spontaneously the path of collective agriculture. Towards the end of the 1920s, the poor supply of industrial products to the countryside tended to reduce the amount of agricultural produce on offer. The authorities reacted with a series of measures which led to the, quote, general crisis of the NEP, end quote. The party leadership reacted to the difficulties that then arose by conducting a frontal attack against the peasantry. The continuation of this attack resulted, during several years, in a radical upheaval of social relationships in the countryside and swept in quite new class relations that were historically unprecedented and in no way corresponded to what the party leaders had forecast, at least overtly, at the end of the 1920s. All right, so here we go. Chapter 1, quote, The Socialist Transformation of Agriculture, end quote, and the Class Struggles. To grasp the significance of what is officially termed the, quote, Socialist Transformation of Agriculture, end quote, it is first necessary to recall briefly some essential aspects of the agrarian structures toward the end of the 1920s and the way in which these structures tended to develop. The existing social relationship toward the end of the NEP in Soviet agriculture resulted from the peasant revolution of 1917. The policies followed afterward by the authorities, and the repetition of peasant practices, which by and large were communal and stemmed from the traditions of the Mir and of the Skad. All right. I have to duplicate this page to find the footnotes. I'm assuming that they're at the end of the chapter, so let's see. Yeah, there's endnotes at the end of the chapter. Footnote: the Mir was the village commune collectively owning the land. The Shkod, S-K-H-O-D, was the peasant assembly. Okay, end footnote. The agriculture that had been, quote, socialized played only a minimal role, supplying only 3.3% of agricultural production. Quote, private agriculture therefore played a quite dominant role. Within the latter, it may be noted that the middle peasants were dominant in the countryside. They accounted for more than 2/3 of the peasantry. Together with the poor peasants, they provided 8 times more grain for the market than the rich peasants. Moreover, the proportion of middle peasants tended to increase, especially through the entry into this category of part of the old poor peasantry. The situation of the middle peasantry and part of the poor peasantry was also strengthened by the development of traditional mutual aid practices and by voluntary association in tens of thousands of, quote, simple production cooperatives. In these ways, the economic weight of these peasant capitalists tended to grow. Up to a certain point, the same thing happened with their political weight, transmitted through the Staat, which in part had restored the role and procedure of the former Obschina. Footnote: interestingly enough, this happened just as Lenin had envisaged it in 1907, a time when he defined the Obschina as a local organization of self-management. See The Agrarian Question in the Russian Revolution, and the quotation from this piece in S. Grosskopf, L'Alliance ouvrière et paysanne in URSS, 1921 to 1928. This quote worried the Soviet leaders. That's a piece by Lenin, The Agrarian Question in Russia. End footnote. In fact, contrary to the official propaganda of the late 1920s, whose most important themes are repeated by present-day Soviet propaganda, it was not at all a question of a rise to power of the rich peasants or the coming to a head of a threat that these kulaks could have brought to bear simultaneously on middle and poor peasants and on food supply for the towns, nor was it a question of a genuine spontaneous aggravation of the social contradictions inside the village. Of course, these contradictions existed during the new economic policy, but the possibility also existed, and the facts demonstrate this, that these contradictions could have manifested themselves in a strengthening of the situation of the great majority of the peasants, and by their voluntary entry into the cooperative system. It could be added that this has generally been overlooked because there has been confusion between the, quote, division of the peasantry according to external economic criteria and its division into classes, which depend on production and labor relationships. These realities should be borne in mind when seeking to uncover the social forces which impelled, quote, collectivization, and when seeking reasons for collectivization ended in the destruction of what had been gained from the peasant revolution, in the expropriation of the peasantry and an upsurge of new exploitative relationships. In fact, contrary to the official picture, collectivization did not result from the struggle by poor and middle peasants more and more exploited and oppressed by the kulaks. Quote, collectivization resulted from the intervention of social forces external to the village, which exacerbated and made use of the internal contradictions within the village. These social forces were those of the party, which had become all-powerful in the state. These social forces led to a specific capitalist transformation of the Soviet countryside. These social forces led to a specific capitalist transformation of the Soviet countryside, parenthesis, when the latter was in no way developing into a, quote, peasant capitalism, end quote. The triumph of this rural capitalist revolution required that the peasants should be reduced to servitude and their resistance shattered. It is here that lies the true meaning of the vicissitudes of collectivization. Without understanding this, one might believe that these tragic events resulted from an insane venture that brought long-term ruin to Soviet agriculture and which in an absurd way launched the USSR into a chain of events, quote, full of noise and fury, end quote. To trace accurately the history of these events, we must go back to 1928 to 29. Footnote. A quite detailed analysis of what happened in this time in the Soviet countryside has been given in Volume 2 of this work. The reader may refer to this. Here we are looking at only those aspects which illuminate the way in which social forces external to the village, present, forces present in the leading party, made use of the peasantry's internal contradictions in order to subordinate it to now exploitative relationships. End footnote. New section. The years 1928 to 29. In consequence of the policies adopted for agricultural prices and for deliveries of industrial products to the peasants, particularly of products which they needed to develop their production, 1927 ended in a fiasco over the procurement of cereals by the state, and also by the official cooperatives, The leadership of the party decided at the beginning of 1928 to take, quote, urgent measures, end quote, which were regarded as the only measures that were practicable. In accordance with these measures, the peasants had to deliver to the state the grain that the peasants held, and for this they received a very low official price. If the peasants responded with a refusal, the authorities had recourse to, quote, exceptional measures, which in particular allowed them to act under Article 107 of the Penal Code of the RSFSR. That is, they could seize the assets of the peasants and confiscate them. Let's see. Yeah, in Wikipedia it just says Article 107 of the Criminal Code was the legal means by which the state acquired grain. The Soviet government responded to these acts by cutting off food rations to peasants and areas where there was opposition to collectivization, especially in Ukraine. Back to the text. These confiscations were carried out with the help of numerous officials and of, quote, worker brigades, end quote, sent from the towns. In principle, these measures of coercion were only applied to the kulaks, but in fact they were applied to all peasants, mainly to middle peasants who held the most grain. These measures were carried out brutally, especially after the spring of 1928, when famine began to be seriously felt. From that time, the poor peasants, who more or less had upheld the exceptional measures during the winter months, became hostile to such an extent that at the end of the spring almost all the villages were clearly against the policy adopted for the villages. In the middle of June 1928, M.I. Frumkin wrote in a letter addressed to the Central Committee, quote, the village, apart from a small section of the poor peasantry, is against us, end quote. M.I. Frumkin. Frumkin, actually. Frumkin. I'm not seeing anything for this person. Back to the text. Oh, actually, there's a footnote. Quoted in Lorenz Sozialgeschichte der Soviet Union, which I think is a social history of the Soviet Union. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for this person. End footnote. Discontent was also felt in the towns. The Soviet Union at the time experienced the most serious social and political crisis since the Kronstadt uprising. In July, the Central Committee decided to annul the, quote, exceptional measures, which it emphasized were, quote, temporary, and condemned those applications of them, which had given rise to, quote, violations of revolutionary legality, end quote, to legal searches and to administrative arbitrariness, etc. Sorry, 1 second. Nevertheless, some months later, because of the, quote, insufficiency of the tax in kind, quote, exceptional measures were again taken with the application of coercion against the peasantry. Delivery quotas were imposed on the peasants. If the peasants did not fulfill these delivery quotas, the authorities levied heavy fines, which often even took the form of expropriation and expulsion from the village. In this way, from the winter of 1928 to 1929, there was a partial, quote, dekulakization. Like the dekulakization which would follow, this affected not only the rich peasants but also the middle peasants, and these measures in effect implied the abandonment of the NEP. They were felt to be an attack on the peasantry and shatter the sympathetic feelings which the village still retained for the government. Yeah, the hammer and sickle, just a side note, the hammer and sickle stands for the, smichka, the unity of the workers and peasants. But it's like a cruel joke to see it on the banner of a society that fundamentally smashed the smichka. Where am I? Just real quick for a refresher for everybody. According to Wikipedia, dekulakization was the Soviet campaign of political repressions, including arrest, deportation, or executions of millions of supposed kulaks, wealthy peasants and their families. Redistribution of farmland started in 1917 and lasted in 1933, but was most active in the 1929 to 1932 period of the first five-year plan. To facilitate the expropriations of farmland, the Soviet government announced the, quote, liquidation of the kulaks as a class. On the 27th of September 1929, portraying kulaks as class enemies in the Soviet Union. More than 1.8 million peasants were deported into 1930 to 1931. The campaign had the stated purpose of fighting counter-revolution and of building socialism in the countryside. This policy, carried out simultaneously with collectivization in the Soviet Union, effectively brought all agriculture and all the laborers in Soviet Russia under state control. Back to the text. New section. The reintroduction of compulsory deliveries and the first wave of collectivization, 1929 to 1930. And there's the first heading is heading A, the frontal attack against the peasantry after the harvest of 1929. While fixing quite ambitious but apparently realizable targets for the development of kolkhozes and sovkhozes, collective farms and state farms, the 17th Party Conference made concessions to the poor and middle peasants who were still regarded as the dominant people in the countryside. The conference reiterated its condemnation of, quote, violations of socialist legality, end quote. However, just before the summer 1929 harvest, despite all the previous assurances, the government fixed compulsory deliveries similar to those of, quote, war communism. Local authorities themselves evaluated the, quote, grain surpluses, end quote, of the village and fixed the, quote, delivery norms of each producer. It was a question of compelling the peasants to fulfill the, quote, local delivery plans, end quote. Given the level at which the majority of these, quote, norms were fixed, this meant the confiscation from the majority of the peasants of the results of their work. In other words, a brutal pillage of the peasantry. Special commissions, quote, checked the fulfillment of the delivery plans. The village Soviets, in actual fact controlled by the party, were given the right to inflict heavy fines and to change the apportionment of the compulsory deliveries. In order to reduce the insupportable burden that these deliveries imposed on them, the poor peasants managed to get the quotas increased for the rich and better off peasants. Peasants taxed in this way had not only to sell their livestock and their equipment, but also their domestic utensils, furniture, and even residential and farm buildings in order to purchase, illegally, from the market, the grain that they had to deliver to the state. Some peasants were driven to disappear, or had to reduce their sowings and liquidate part of their animal or mechanical assets. In 1929 alone, the number of horses diminished by 2.6 million, and of cows by 7.6 million. This expropriation of part of the peasantry required an enormous mobilization of the party and state apparatus, recourse to military and police methods, and at the same time entailed a reduction in 1929 of the sown area and cattle. Footnote. See U.A. Moshkov, something in Russian, and R. Bierman, The Grain Problem and Anti-Speculation Laws. Not seeing anything for this Moshkov person. Yeah, I'm not seeing any, there's no abstract for this, for the Bierman piece either. So, end footnote. The wish of the authorities to get hold of the largest possible quantity of agricultural products and to weaken the peasantry in this way triumphed over the desire to develop seriously, or even simply to maintain, the level of agricultural and productive resources. The aims of the new exploitative urban class had more weight than economic considerations, or the, quote, alliance with the peasantry. Heading B. The escalating collectivization, quote, aims, in the fall of 1929 to January 1930. At the top level of the party apparatus during the summer and fall of 1929, there was a strengthening of the position of those who had decided to put an end to the NEP and to destroy the results of the peasant revolution by instituting new agrarian structures which would permit the maximum exploitation of rural society. Although the 16th Party Congress had adopted the, quote, optimal version of the 5-year plan and targets for collectivization which seemed to be realizable, 7 months later things took quite a different turn. What happened was that at the plenum which met November 10th to 17th, the annual plan for 1929 to 30 was adopted. The targets of this plan were very high and no longer corresponded at all with those of the 5-year plan adopted several months earlier. Stalin had declared that the peasants were joining the kolkhozes as entire villages and even entire districts, and a new upward revision of the, quote, collectivization targets was made in accordance with the, quote, sowing plan for the countryside for spring 1930, end quote. Parenthesis, this plan was ratified on December 23rd, 1929, in parenthesis. This is the end of the series of decisions of this nature, for a decision of the Central Committee of January 5th, 1930, fixed, quote, socialization targets, which were even higher. The table below shows the upward move of targets, which was to turn upside down the agrarian structures of the USSR. And there's a chart here whose title is Agricultural, quote, socialization targets, parenthesis, socialized sown areas in millions of hectares, end parenthesis. Basically, what the chart shows that the annual plan I don't know. He'll explain the chart, I guess. I can't really read it out loud. It may be noted that in December 1929, the, quote, targets forecast for 1933 had already been exceeded by the targets for 1930, and that the forecast of, quote, collectivization doubled between November and December 1929. The resolution of January 5th, 1930 established, quote, as a task of the collectivization of the great majority of peasant households, end quote, during the 5-year period. Moreover, it provided that by the fall of 1930, or at the latest spring 1931, quote, complete, end quote, splashnaya, end parenthesis, splashnaya, end parenthesis, collectivization would be largely achieved in the main grain regions of the lower and middle Volga and in the North Caucasus, and 1 year later, the other grain regions. There's a footnote that I missed. It says, according to these targets, the sown area of the sovkhozes was to double in 1 year. They had been 1.8 million hectares in 1929. From 1930, socialist agriculture was to provide 50% of the grain distributed outside the villages. Exclamation point. And footnote. The resolution of January 5th, 1930 established that in principle the artel would be the main form of collectivization, and it favored the formation of large kolkhozes. Fixing targets and such precise figures for, quote, collectivization contradicted the principle of, quote, voluntary acceptance of the kolkhoz by the peasants. The contradiction became especially obvious when the Central Committee, unblushingly at the same time, warned, quote, party organization against any attempt to influence the collectivization movement by means of decrees from above, end quote. As things turned out, the forced collectivization campaign was speeded up by repressive measures adopted under the pretext of, quote, liquidating the kulaks as a class, end quote, and by the application of various administrative measures. New section. C. Quote, administrative measures, preparing and accompanying, quote, collectivization from above, end quote. From summer 1929, various administrative measures were taken, having the effect of putting pressure on the peasantry. This pressure aimed not only to increase the quantity of grain processed by the state, it served also to, quote, induce the peasants to enter the kolkhozes and to, quote, accept that the latter would be the size desired by the authorities. As early as June 27, 1929, the Central Committee constructed the administration of the cooperatives, parenthesis, purchase, sale, credit, etc., end parenthesis, to, quote, adapt itself, end quote, to the demands of collectivization, particularly by encouraging the establishment of big kolkhozes and even of, quote, giant kolkhozes. In practice, this meant the destruction of the small and medium kolkhozes that the peasants had started and themselves directed, and the imposition on the peasantry of the formation of large-scale kolkhozes, to which it was usually hostile, because it could not control their management. This implied that the peasants were completely separated from the means of production. The peasants were completely separated from their means of production. In August 1929, the Central Committee issued directives for the development of the system of contracts. Let me see if I can type this in. KONT Raktat Sia. Is that right? I don't know. This system made the supply of industrial products to the agricultural producers depend on the obligatory deliveries undertaken by the latter. This system made the supply of industrial products to the agricultural producers depend on the obligatory deliveries undertaken by the agricultural producers. Thus, the agricultural producers undertook in advance to deliver definite quantities of agricultural products to the procurement organizations. These undertakings resulted from decisions taken by the peasant associations of the villages, decisions which were followed by contracts signed between the state and the associations. In reality, the associations took no, quote, decisions. The associations were placed in a situation where all the associations could do was to ratify, quote, proposals made by the procurement organizations. However, these, quote, decisions, once these decisions had been approved by the majority, were imposed on every member of the peasant association. However, these, quote, decisions, once these, quote, decisions had been approved by the majority, were imposed on every member of the peasant association. The procurement organizations could quite easily get their proposals ratified because a refusal to accept their proposals would entail various sanctions, beginning with the cessation of supply of industrial products. The same sanctions were used against members of an association that did not fulfill the, quote, promises that had been made. From October 1929, the Council of Ministers stipulated that contracts should cover several years, and the signatories of the contract should, in principle, form themselves into kolkhozes. The signatories of the contract should, in principle, form themselves into kolkhozes, thereby installing a new means of exerting pressure in favor of collectivization. Parallel with the development of the contract system, centralized and complex administrative structures were reinforced. These had to facilitate the procurement of agricultural products and accelerate collectivization. Moreover, they had to provide managerial staff for the kolkhozes. Thus, for the management of the kolkhozes, there was the district, parenthesis, Rayon, and parenthesis, kolkhoz union, parenthesis, kolkhozos soyuz, and parenthesis at the bottom, and at the top there were equivalent organizations for the regions and the federated republics. From October 1929, another element of the kolkhoz's managerial structure, the kolkhozcenter, became a central Soviet-style organ entrusted with the supply of equipment at credit to the kolkhozes, which it agreed contracts and for whose production it arranged the procurement. It also elaborated, in association with Gosplan, a plan for the development of the activities of the kolkhoz sector and it also prepared the operating rules for the kolkhozes, etc. Footnote. There's a couple of footnotes. Alec Nova also notes its destruction of what was authentically cooperative. See Alec Nova, An Economic History of the USSR, which I've looked up a million times, so I'm not going to look that up again. And footnote. Well, up to 1929, the kolkhozes formed spontaneously by the peasants were small, embracing 10 to 15 families and covering 50 to 80 hectares. In 1937, they comprised an average of 75 families. The government later went in for giant kolkhozes covering thousands of hectares and grouping hundreds of families. On this point, see the Documents and Materiali Poistrelli. So, I don't know. Bunch of stuff in Russian. See Moshe Lewin, Russian Peasants and Soviet Power. And something else in Russian. The description for this book says, it starts with a praise from Stephen F. Cohen. A most important and pioneering book, the only full-scale study of the Russian Revolution and the peasant from 1917 through the first wave of mass collectivization in 1930. And the description says, the collectivization of the peasants in the USSR constituted a social upheaval of totally unprecedented nature. It was one of the most remarkable events of the present century, and has a history as long as that of Soviet power itself. The idea of a collectivized agriculture, much favored by the leadership after the revolution, had been left in abeyance during the new economic policy period. Interest in the idea and in the collective movement revived at the time of the, quote, grain crisis at the beginning of 1928. It was during this crisis that collectivization of the peasantry and the creation of a powerful kolkhoz and sovkhoz sector began to be taken seriously as a means of solving, at one and the same time, both the formidable problem of grain and the whole, quote, accursed problem of relations between Soviet authorities and the peasants. Back to the text. End footnote. This administrative structure left no place whatsoever for any initiatives of the kolkhozes and of the kolkhoz members, either in the realm of production and delivery plans or in the internal regulation of the kolkhozes. During the summer of 1929, the existing system of machine and tractor stations, MTS, and tractor columns were unified within the framework of the new central administration, the tractor center. See, I can't really copy and paste things from this article, and let me try. Tractor Tractort and okay, I'm not saying anything for that. Back to the text. In sum, the decisions adopted during the second half of 1929 ended with the development of a variegated agricultural administration. The latter included, apart from the organizations already mentioned, offices entrusted with the commercial side of the different products, and others charged with the making of certain cultivation contracts, and finally the People's Commissariat for Agriculture, Narkomzem, whose competence extended over the entire Soviet Union. Wikipedia says, People's Commissariat for Agriculture was set up in Petrograd in October 1917. Vladimir Miliutin was appointed the first People's Commissar of Agriculture. Vladimir Miliutin was a member of the Council of the People's Commissars, Sovnarkom. The Narkomzem offices located at Orlikov Pereulok 1, Moscow, were designed by Alexei Shusev in 1928. The building is currently occupied by the Ministry of Agriculture of the Russian Federation. Following the establishment of Sovnarkom at the Second All-Russian Congress of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, Soviets, Lenin attended the extraordinary All-Russian Congress of Soviets of Peasants Deputies, where he promised that the left socialist revolutionaries could select one of their members to become the Narkomsim Commissar. Andrei Kolegeyev was appointed to this position on the 23rd of December 1917. In 1946, the commissariat was replaced by the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. Back to the text. This administrative structure was burdensome and difficult to coordinate, and therefore the different organizations which it comprised were often in conflict with each other and gave contradictory directives to the kolkhozes and to the peasant associations. The total result of these measures was nothing less than constant pressure exercised on the peasants so as to increase the total procurement of products and the area of collectivized land. These pressures took all kinds of forms: financial, commercial, technical. The peasants who did not, quote, cooperate were deprived of supplies, credits, etc., which were promised to others, end parenthesis. I don't know if I said parenthesis. The peasants who did not, quote, cooperate were deprived of supplies, credits, etc., which were promised others, end parenthesis. There were also administrative, political, judicial, and penal pressures. Administrative and political pressures were exercised through the party organization and through the local bureaucracy. At first, they were presented simply as a, quote, activation of cadres entrusted with propaganda in favor of collectivization and of the procurement of produce. Thus, from the summer 1929, the villages received an increasing number of visits from party organizers and propagandists. These cadres arrived from the town, collected together the assemblies, and called on them to vote for increases in delivery plans for the formation of kolkhozes. They also made an effort to, quote, animate the rural Soviets and to organize the poor peasants. In this way, the great excitement which then developed originated mainly from elements external to the village, who were quite ignorant of agricultural and peasant problems. Simultaneously, there was a reinforcement of other means of pressure. For example, those who seemed, quote, indifferent to the current campaigns were easily accused of, quote, kulak activity, end quote. The peasant penal sanctions which struck at such activities were intensified, and the same thing happened with the sanctions for the non-delivery of the amounts of agricultural production envisaged by the Kontraktatsia. The description, quote, kulak activity became more and more frequent. Often it amounted to the, quote, paying off of accounts, end quote, between certain villagers, but it became one of the principal methods of advancing the procurement of products and accelerating collectivization. At this stage, the manipulation of penal measures played a decisive role. At the beginning of 1929, the peasants had to pay to the state a fine equal to 5 times the quantity of products which ought to have been delivered to the state and which had not been so delivered. From June 1929, the non-delivery of products which should have been supplied was punished by prison sentences, by confiscation of property, and even by deportation. In principle, the most severe punishments were to be applied only to kulaks, but this principle is frequently violated, and severe punishments were also applied to medium and even to poor peasants. Moreover, refusal to enter a kolkhoz was considered to be a, quote, kulak activity, were, quote, counter-revolutionary and punished as such. New section, Section D, the immediate results of these measures. In the short term, the measures taken from the fall of 1929 had a, quote, positive effect on the progress of collectivization. The table below shows this. So, beginning on June 1st, 1928, the percentage of collectivized households was 2.1. By March 1st, 1930, the percentage of collectivized households was 59.3. It looks like the biggest jump was between January 20th and February 20th, 1930. On January 20th, 1930, 21% of collectivized households, and by February 20th, 1930, there was 50% of collectivized households, or 50% collectivized households. The, quote, progress thus achieved developed in a chaotic and contradictory way because, contrary to the official claims of that period, the majority of peasants adhered to the kolkhoz unwillingly, for fear of administrative, financial, and commercial sanctions, and above all by the fear, justified, of being classed as a kulak, of seeing their property confiscated, or being deported or executed. One second. Footnote. C. M. Lewin, Russian Peasants, and E. Zaleski, Planification de la croissance et fluctuation économique in USSR. Bettelheim, Les Planifications Soviétiques, 1945. Reference to the various Soviet sources used can be found in these books. The percentages quoted here correspond to orders of size and not to an absolute measure. The fact that the figures include a first decimal digit should not be taken as evidence of precision. Calculations later made with archival material show that the statistics of the period are apparently acceptable, with the qualification that different regions whose figures make up these documents did not stick always to a rigid definition of, quote, household collectivized, end quote. End footnote. Recourse to repressive measures, arrest, executions, and deportations grew to such a scale in January and February 1930 that it engendered violent discontent among the peasantry and even early stages of revolt. At the end of February, the situation had seriously deteriorated. Stalin then decided to temporarily suspend the collectivization movement. On the 2nd of March 1930, just as the procurement had achieved a record level, Stalin published the article titled Giddy with Success. I think it's generally translated Dizzy with Success, that article. Wikipedia says Dizzy with Success concerning questions of the collective farm movement is an article by Joseph Stalin that was published in Pravda on the 2nd of March 1930. In the article, Stalin claimed that agricultural collectivization had been carried out with excessive zeal leading to excesses that had to be corrected. Back to the text. New section. The Truce of Spring and Summer 1930. The publication of this article by Stalin marks a truce in the offensive for, quote, collectivization, end quote. This truce was imposed by the necessity to restore conditions relatively favorable for the spring sowings, otherwise there would have been famine in the land. Stalin's article denounced the methods used for some months which, he said, could only, quote, discredit the idea of collectivization at one blow, end quote, and were worthy of, quote, Sergeant Prichibayev. Not seeing anything for that. It's probably spelled differently in now than it was at this time. It is not clear whether the Central Committee of the Politburo had been consulted about this article. In any case, it disconcerted the local cadres because the latter had had every reason to believe that, in relying on the methods now condemned by Stalin, they were simply adhering to instructions from their superiors. Some cadres even believed that the article was false and tried to prevent its distribution, going as far as seizing it from the peasants. Footnote. Oh, I missed a footnote. State procurements for grain rose 16.1 and 22.1 million tons in 1929 and 30 against 10.8 million in 1928. End footnote. And footnote, Stalin, Leninism. One second. End footnote. The new direction indicated by Stalin in Stalin's article of March 2nd was confirmed by a resolution of the Central Committee of March 14th, 1930. The Central Committee described the, quote, collectivization methods condemned by Stalin as, quote, deviations from the party line, end quote, and held the lower cadres responsible for these deviations. Footnote. The term Charter of Freedom was used by A.L. Strong in the Stalin era, published in 1959. I think Anna Louisa Strong was like a pretty pro-Chinese communist. A.L. Strong, the Stalin period. The Stalin era. I guess this is a quote from the book. I'm not sure. It says, I think that looking back, men will call it the, quote, Stalin era. Tens of millions of people built the world's first socialist state, but Stalin was the engineer. Stalin gave voice to the thought that the peasant land of Russia could do it. And that typo, or that's awkward. That's an awkward sentence. I don't know if there's a typo in there, but it's awkward. From that time on, Stalin's mark was on all of it, on all the gains and all the evils. It is too soon to sum up the era, and yet one must try to, for controversy has arisen over it, and the beliefs of many around the world are being torn. It is the very best people who are most disturbed by Khrushchev's revelations of thousands of brutal injustices and harsh repressions when socialism was for the first time built. They are. Was this necessary? Is that always the path to socialism? Or was it the evil genius of one man? And it looks like The Stalin Era by Anna Louisa Strong was published originally in 1956. Back to the text. Investigations were then started with the aim of, quote, correcting the mistakes that had been made, end quote. However, in spite of the condemnation of, quote, mistaken methods, very few of the peasants who had been sentenced before March 1930 were, quote, rehabilitated. In fact, deportations continued. The staying at home or the return of those who had been subject to unjust condemnations and cruel treatment would have been too dangerous for the local cadres who had been responsible for misdeeds, confiscations, and exactions. But these cadres, although, quote, disavowed by the party leadership, usually retained their positions. There was considerable discontent among the local cadres. This can be traced in the press and in the Smolensk archives. Footnote: these archives, seized by the German army when it occupied the city of Smolensk, were later captured by the U.S. Army and can be consulted in the USA. Merle Feinsod made a partial scan of them when he published his book Smolensk Under Soviet Rule. On this point, see also Volume 2 of this present work. Wikipedia says Merle Feinsod lived from 1907 to 1972 and was an American political scientist best known for his work on public administration and as a scholar of the Soviet Union. Merle Feinsod's books, Smolensk Under Soviet Rule, based on documents captured by the German army during World War II, and How Russia is Ruled, also known as How the Soviet Union is Governed, helped form the basis of American study of the Soviet Union and established Merle Feinsod, quote, as a leading political scientist of the Soviet Union, end quote. Merle Feinsod is also remembered for his work in the Office of Price Administration and as the director of the Harvard University Library. Back to the text and footnote. Present-day Soviet literature also draws attention to this discontent. For example, it is possible to read how the secretary of an important party organization, named Kataevich, attacked, in a letter of the 6th of April 1930, in a letter of April 6, 1930, accusations leveled at the local cadres alone. Kataevich says, quote, we are receiving numerous complaints from party cadres that they have been unjustifiably treated as idiots. Really, instructions should have been given to the central press so that while criticizing the deviations and the excesses which have been committed, it criticized and ridiculed not solely the local officials, end quote. Kataevich. Stalin therefore found it necessary to review once again the, quote, collectivization methods, end quote. This took the form of an article published in Pravda on the 3rd of April 1930 and entitled A Reply to the Kolkhoz Comrades. Here Stalin treats the, quote, mistakes concerning the peasant question, end quote. Stalin claims that what is at the root of these errors, quote, is the mistaken way of treating the middle peasants. It is the violence used in the economic relationships with the middle peasant. It is forgetting the fact that the economic alliance with the mass of middle peasants must be based not on measures of coercion, but an understanding with the middle peasant and on the alliance with the middle peasant, end quote. Stalin. Considerations like these characterize the directives issued during the first months of this year, and they all have an underlying motivation. The latter is the fear of explosive discontent of the peasantry and the fear of seeing exasperated peasants neglect their work in the fields. The underlying motivation is the fear of explosive discontent of the peasantry and the fear of seeing exasperated peasants neglect their work in the fields. Hence the slogan, quote, proper organization of sowing, that is the task, end quote. Stalin. As soon as pressure was relaxed on the peasants, their fundamentally hostile attitude to, quote, collectivization showed itself quite openly. For example, the proportion of household, quote, collectivized, end quote, diminished, as can be seen from the following table. It says on March 1st, 1930, there's 59.3. And by October 1st, 1930, the percentage of collective households is 21.7. In October 1930, the number of, quote, collectivized households reached its lowest level. Part of the peasants still remaining in the kolkhozes were there because those peasants had no other means of surviving since, following the expropriation and liquidation of the, quote, kulaks, the major share of the means of production in the village was concentrated in the kolkhozes. Other peasants stayed in the, quote, collective farms because they feared that there would be another, quote, change of line. The latter did occur when the 1930 harvest was almost finished and when at the top of the party the last remnants of resistance to a resumption of, quote, collectivization from above had been shattered. Footnote. The, quote, right of the party suffered new defeats in 1930, following the 16th Party Congress on the 26th of June and July 13th. Tomsky was excluded from the Politburo. However, the same Congress again re-elected Bukharin to the Central Committee. On November 19, 1930, Bukharin, quote, capitulated. See his declaration in Pravda of November 20th. Although this, quote, capitulation was considered, quote, minimal, it gave the signal for the suspension of all attempts at criticism of, quote, collectivization from above, end quote. Those who continued to make such criticisms were then hit hard. See Stephen Cohen's article, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution. Or his book, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution. End footnote. At this point, collectivization resumed in a manner more systematic than in the preceding winter. This new collectivization continued steadily throughout the 1930s. New section. Section 3. The course of the, quote, socialist offensive, end quote, in the campaigns of the 1930s. In fact, in the spring of 1930, peasant discontent having been somewhat moderated, thanks to decisions taken at the beginning of March, the sowing campaign had been successful. Moreover, the weather had been favorable. For the authorities, this harvest was particularly encouraging because this harvest enabled them to more than double the grain collection compared to 1928. These two successes persuaded the authorities that the situation in the countryside was henceforth, quote, under control, and that the collectivization campaign could be restarted. Up to the end of 1930, the, quote, pressure put on the peasants increased only slightly. Thus, on the 1st of January 1931, the percentage of households that had been collectivized was only 27.5%. The slowness of this growth was not in accord with the, quote, objectives of the authorities. The latter then decided to hurry things along. From the first months of 1931, there was a renewal of, quote, pressure. The percentage of collectivized households grew sharply. By July 1st, 1931, it reached 57.1%. Henceforth, it was, quote, methods, end quote, which were in question. The decision to carry out collectivization was irrevocable, whatever it might be the, quote, cost for the peasants and for immediate production. The authorities wanted to put the peasantry into a strictly subordinate position and to have available structures which would permit them to impose the highest possible grain delivery. Toward the end of the 1930s, the aims that the authorities pursued in this manner were to all intents and purposes achieved. Consequently, the official history of the party could proclaim the, quote, dazzling victories of socialism, end quote. Footnote, see History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, Moscow, 1939. The following official figures illustrate this, quote, victory. In 1939, the, quote, individual peasants were only 3.1% of the rural population. At the same period, there were 81.4 million kolkhozniks, compared to 2.3 million in 1928. The number of people belonging to the families of state farm workers and MTS workers was around 8 million, or 7% of the rural population. Footnote. See the figures given for 1930. The figures given for 1939 are those of A. Arut Yunan, something published in Moscow in 1971. For 1928, see S. Grosskopf, L'Alliance. For the various changes in the Soviet countries, see B. Kerbley, La Société Soviétique Contemporaine. End footnote. Thus, the millions of peasants, living in conditions of great inequality, and the tens of millions of genuine cooperative members who were in existence at the end of the 1920s were replaced by kolkhozniks and by the wage earners of the state farms and MTS. The official comment on these figures affirms that during the 1930s, a, quote, new world had been born in the Soviet countryside. This is undeniable. But what was this, quote, new world? This question cannot be answered without examining more closely the conditions in which it was born, the social relationships on which it was built, and the economic conditions in which it functioned. New section. Section 4. Collectivization and mass repression. The, quote, collectivization campaign of winter 1929 to 30 was used as a, quote, model for the latter collectivization campaign, in spite of the, quote, reprimand and the, quote, calls to order addressed in the base and local cages over the publication of Satan of Stalin's article and the decisions of the Central Committee of March and April 1930. The inquiries that were opened at this time gave a quite good picture of the, quote, methods used for collectivization, end quote, but there is only partial knowledge of their findings. The latter are mostly accessible through certain statements made by the authorities and some articles which are based on a small portion of archival documents. Nevertheless, what is known is enough to reveal the scale of the anti-peasant repression and its mainly blind and arbitrary character. Numerous executions and expropriations were carried out under pretexts that were absurd and lacking any, quote, legal base. Quite a few operations had the effect of enriching local cadres or satisfying quarrels. The superior authorities usually let these things happen, or even encourage these things to happen, because these operations, parenthesis, even when these operations caused violent local reactions, end parenthesis, did meet the main demand. They fostered terror and paralyzed the peasants. The Ukraine was one of the republics where the anti-peasant repression connected with, quote, collectivization and with pseudo, quote, decolonization was most severe. In certain regions of this republic, up to 50% of peasant households were, quote, dekulakized. This proportion is at least 5 times greater than the number of households which up to then had been officially considered as, quote, kulak. This clearly means that the majority of those who were stricken in no way belonged to this social group. Moreover, numerous investigations show that any occurrence was likely to become a pretext for, quote, dekulakization. For example, simple peasant brawls were described by the courts as, quote, terroristic acts, and were categorized among, quote, counter-revolutionary activities which could entail the death penalty. There's a footnote, l'État et la classe sociale in URSS 1929 to 1933. Moshe Lewin. Thus, in the rayon of the giant kolkhoz, which was called Gigant, it is known that of the 1,200 households, quote, dekulakized in 1930, 400 were later officially recognized as Serednyak, middle peasant households. In one Ukrainian village, about 85% of the, quote, dekulakized households, mostly condemned to deportation, were later reclassed as Serednyaki. Tried to look that up, but I didn't see anything. In principle, such deportees, if they survived, were authorized to return to their village. In reality, this authorization often had no effect. Investigations show that at the beginning of 1930, in many cases, Serednyaki were, quote, dekulakized under feudal pretexts, perhaps because they had sold a cow some months earlier, or even hay. Footnote, see the article by A. Angelov, Rural Soviets and the Liquidation of the Kulaks as a Class, published in Bolshevik, number 6, 1930. End footnote. At the beginning of 1930, the anti-peasant repression was intense, that the railways were overloaded with trains of deportees, of how many died en route. The peasants called these trains, quote, death trains. They carried away entire families, and quite often women and children whose husbands and fathers had been, quote, had been executed as, quote, counter-revolutionaries. The number of such trains was so great that it constituted, as was officially admitted, quote, a burden which is beyond the resources of the state, end quote. The Politburo then decided to allocate by quota to the different regions the means of transport for this purpose. The publication of Stalin's article on the 2nd of March 1930 did not change the lot of hundreds of thousands of expropriated peasants. They remained attached to temporary camps where many perished. The expropriations and deportations which followed the resumption of collectivization of the winter of 1930 and 31 therefore followed without any real interruption the deportation of those expropriated in the winter of 1929 to 30. Hence the unending session of, quote, death trains, about which A.L. Strong wrote in 1930, quote, several times during the spring and summer I saw these echelons moving along the railroad, a doleful sight, men, women, and children uprooted. A.L. Strong. Quote, Anna Louise Strong. Another witness of this repression and its results, which continued well beyond 1930 and 1931, was Victor Serge. Quote, trainloads of deported peasants left for the icy north, the forests, the steppes, the deserts. These were whole populations denuded of everything. The old folks starved to death in mid-journey. Newborn babies were buried on the banks of the roadside, and each wilderness had its crop of little crosses of boughs and whitewood. Other populations, dragging all their mean possessions on wagons, rushed toward the frontiers of Poland, Romania, and China, and crossed them by no means intact, to be sure in spite of the machine guns, end quote. Victor Serge. If you look at there's a video on here by Gabriel Myasnikov, and it's an introduction to his piece, The Latest Deception, which is part of a larger body of writing that was stolen in France, but that he preserved. But he talks about, in that introduction, he talks about his getting out of the Soviet Union, of he had to swim across a river in the winter with his bag around his neck in order to get out of the country. So it's kind of related to what Victor Serge just said here. Becoming a kolkhoznik did not shelter a peasant from deportation as a, quote, kulak. Not only could his, quote, past be at any time interpreted to give cause for sentencing, but his current attitude could also be taken as a, quote, sign that he remained a, quote, pro-kulak, therefore lived under the constant threat of being condemned. Such condemnations were not rare, especially those which punished, quote, lack of respect for the, quote, collective property. In fact, the growing demands of the state in the matter of grain deliveries, and the distrust felt by the majority of the party cadres and by the party leaders towards these peasants led to the authorities, quote, harassing the kolkhozniks, this term being used in 1931 by Agricultural Commissar Yakovlev. So I'm trying to look this guy up. Wikipedia says Yakov Yakovlev lived from 1896 to 1938 and was a Soviet politician and statesman who played a central role in the forced collectivization of agriculture in the 1920s. Back to the text. The latter protested against what he called, quote, massed anti-kolkhoz actions, end quote, and declared that members of the kolkhozes had become, quote, an object of unadulterated arbitrariness, end quote. Protests by several party leaders, who would be, quote, purged later, did not help. The brutality and the arbitrariness continued. As for the kolkhozniks, they, quote, cooperated less and less as their feeling that the claimed, quote, collectivization was a, quote, nationalization or, quote, expropriation grew stronger. Footnote. The expression, something in Russian, was even used by a peasant delegate to the Sixth Congress of Soviets. He explained that it meant depriving the peasants of the results of their labor. End footnote. Sentences were pronounced also for what might be called, quote, acts of negligence. The CCC demanded such sentences without any indulgence, end quote. The concept of, quote, negligence was all-embracing. It included even what the authorities described as, quote, irresponsible indifference, categorized as, quote, sabotage. But part of this alleged, quote, sabotage was nothing but the refusal of kolkhozniks to obey irrational directives coming from authorities who overrode the kolkhozniks in deciding where and when to sow, and in issuing absurd orders like, quote, sow on top of the snow, end quote, parenthesis, quote, to save time, end quote, exclamation point, end parenthesis. Footnote. Stalin, in effect, had said that the kolkhozniks lacked experience and it is necessary to make decisions without the kolkhozniks, or even against the kolkhozniks. Advice. That is how Kirov came to give the order to, quote, sow on top of the snow, end quote, and then to arrest those who refuse. End footnote. Thus, the reasons for arresting and deporting peasants and carrying out mass repressions were numerous. Official figures minimized the scale of these measures. Thus, the party history published in 1962 admits that there were a little more than 240,000 families deported, or more than 1,200,000 people. But this figure only covered the period from 1930 to the end of 1932. In the regions of, quote, complete collectivization. Estimate by Moshe Lewin in Russian peasants. End footnote. The measures introduced from the end of 1930 were partly analogous to those taken a little earlier, arrests, deportations, etc., but they were applied with more vigor. In the name of, quote, dekulakization, sentences and deportations recommenced not only of the genuine rich peasants, but also of any peasants suspected or accused, parenthesis, often on a basis of unverifiable denunciations, end parenthesis, of, quote, pro-kulak, sympathy, and described as a, quote, podkulachnik, end quote. Footnote. Literally subkulak, end footnote. The, quote, mass collectivization, end quote, was thus imposed while any misgivings that were felt for it were severely punished. Deportation was the most common punishment, But then too many peasants protested. OGPU, parenthesis, which was authorized to execute without trial, in parenthesis, shot some peasants on the spot, quote, to encourage the militant collectivists, end quote. Footnote, see Ante Siliga, the Russian Enigma. It's very interesting that, because Bettelheim comes out of a Trotskyist background. I mean, not Trotskyist, a Maoist background, which, if you know anything about Maoism, it upholds the virulent, paranoid, conspiracy theorist conceptions about Trotskyism. So it's interesting that obviously we've read, if you're listening to this, you might have heard me read the introduction to this book as well. And if you did, he basically argued, I mean, maybe I misread it, but it definitely seems to argue basically what, in a more, with a greater historical hindsight, basically counsel communist analysis of the Russian Revolution, which I think is super interesting. Back to the text. The Smolensk archives contain numerous reports which give some idea of the scale and brutality of the repression, as well as the fear which it exerted not only in the countryside but also in the towns. Many workers still had their families in the villages. The fear was such that passivity developed. Whereas previously 2 men of the militia were needed to escort one arrested man, in 1931 one militiaman could escort a whole group of prisoners. For many, arrest seemed almost a relief compared with the anguished wait for the arrest. Entire families were arrested, including children. Footnote, see the documents registered under VKP 159 in the Smolensk archives, quoted by M. Fainsod in Smolensk. End footnote. Some parents even preferred to, quote, put an end quote, to their young children rather than see them die in this way. Footnote, see especially on this subject Ante Siliga, the Russian Enigma. What developed was a veritable anti-peasant war. It culminated in 1932 to 34, when the combination of bad harvests, massive requisitions of grain cereals, and the reduction to a minimum of the amount of grain sent back to the hungry villagers condemned millions of peasants to death from famine or undernourishment. The continuance at any price of the massive requisitions of food products by the state organizations entrusted with the procurement and the refusal to give help to the regions stricken by famine can be partly explained by the wish to export grain, so as to permit the purchase of industrial equipment abroad, and by the priority promised for the town's food supply. The Webbs, great admirers of the, quote, collectivization achieved in such conditions, quote, justified the, quote, sentences of death by famine, end quote, in the following words. Quote, collective farms which had willfully neglected or refused to till their land were sternly refused relief when they found themselves without food, so as not to encourage further recussancy, and in some of the worst cases the inhabitants of whole villages, if only in order to save them from starvation, were summarily removed from the land they had neglected or refused to cultivate, and deported elsewhere to find laboring work of any sort for their maintenance. End quote. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. End quote. Not really finding any good descriptions for Sidney and Beatrice Webb, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. But, end footnote. Sorry. I'm spacing out. The repression was supposed to teach the Kolkosniks, quote, uprightness, end quote. Thus, a member of the Central Committee, Chaboldoev, declared to the 17th Party Conference from the 30th of January to February 4th, 1932, that they, quote, were not sufficiently honest in regard to state interests, end quote. Sorry, footnote. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find anything for this. I'm looking for this, this figure, but these spellings are not helping me. The repression was, end footnote, the repression was supposed to teach the Kolkosniks, quote, uprightness. Thus, a member of the Central Committee, Chaboldoev, declared to the 17th Party Conference from January 30th to February 4th, 1932, that they, quote, were not sufficiently honest in regard to state interests, end quote. Footnote, quoted by Moshe in Society and the Stalinist State in the Period of the 5-Year Plans. And footnote, in order to teach the Kolkosniks to be, quote, upright, the Central Committee called for punishment, quote, without indulgence, for any refusal to deliver grain. The grain collection campaign became a test of strength, or as Kaganovich said, quote, the touchstone of our strength or weakness, and of the strength and weakness of our enemies, end quote. I think Lazar Kaganovich was like kind of like a diehard Stalinist who kind of like faded into obscurity to some extent after the death of Stalin, but always kind of like, I think he was like kind of an advocate of Stalin's legacy in the Soviet Union. But Lazar Kaganovich, the thing that I find fascinating about him is that he lived a really long time. I think he he was alive during the Bolshevik Revolution and was alive during the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Like, imagine I don't know, I just think it's crazy to see, like, all that history, because I think there's very few people. I don't know anyone else by name. I'm sure there's other people as well that lived through that entirety of the Soviet Union's existence. But he did, and that's super weird or interesting. The grain collection campaigns became a test of strength, or as Kaganovich said, quote, the touchstone of our strength or weakness, and of the strength and weakness of our enemies, end quote. Any, quote, indulgence of lower cages towards the peasants, for example, quote, indulgence, which cages might demonstrate by asking for a reduction of procurements imposed on peasants affected by famine, was considered as, quote, aid given to the enemy, end quote, and was punished as such. So as to permit the, quote, punishment of the peasants, there had to be further development of the repressive mechanism, promulgation of new laws, and the extended interpretation of those laws already in force. Thus the law of August 7th, 1932, which the peasants called the law of 7/8, was promulgated to enlarge the repressive arsenal. Let's see if there's anything if I type that date up. August 7th, 1932. Let's check it out, baby. It's the law of spikelets. Let's look that up. Very interesting. Just to reread the law of the spikelets. The law of spikelets, or the law of three spikelets, was a decree in the Soviet Union to protect state property or causes collective farms, especially the grain they produce, from theft, largely by desperate peasants during the Soviet famine of 1932 to 33. The decree was known as the, quote, 7/8 laws, because the date in Russian is filled in to forms as 7/8, 1932. 7th of August, 1932. The law provided a severe punishment for stolen collective and cooperative property, quote, execution with confiscation of all property and replacement in mitigating circumstances, with imprisonment for at least 10 years with confiscation of all property, end quote. Amnesty was prohibited in these cases. Although the formal name of the law was no longer the common names Law of Spikelets and Law of Three Spikelets, came into use because of the article and brochure of Prosecutor General A. Vyshinsky, 1933, where he condemned the practice to prosecute both corrupt officials and also those who gleaned the grains or spikelets left behind in the fields after the entire harvest was officially collectivized and counted. The decree was accepted and sometimes overly harshly used during the Soviet famine of 1932 to 33. In 1936, the cases of the application of the law were reconsidered, and over 60% of the convicted were released. It says 1936, 118,360 inmates. In 1937, 44,409 inmates. Back to the text. Thus, the law of the 7th of August, 1932, which the peasants called the Law of 7/8, was promulgated to enlarge the repressive arsenal. The law of spikelets allowed, for example, sentences of 6 years of deportation for the gathering of ears of corn by the hungry. Tens of thousands of peasants, including children, were deported by virtue of this law. These sentences were in addition to arbitrary measures imposed on the spot by different commissions. They were also in addition to the increasingly numerous sentences pronounced by virtue of Article 58 of the Penal Code of the USSR. Interpreting this article in an all-embracing way, tribunals attributed bad harvests to the pitiful state of agricultural equipment, etc., to, quote, wreckers who were arrested, imprisoned, deported, or detained in camps. The duration of these sanctions could be 10 years or more. Footnote. The text of this Article 58 figures in the Penal Code of the USSR, promulgated in 1926. It is drawn in so vague a fashion that it allows a very wide interpretation. As became evident in the 1930s, the text of Article 58 can be found in Robert Conquest, it says R. Conquest, The Great Terror, published in 1968. Where am I? There's a Wikipedia for the Great Terror. The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s is a book by British historian Robert Conquest, which was published in 1968. It gave rise to an alternate title of the period in Soviet history known as The Great Purge. Conquest's title was also an evocation allusive to the period which is called the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, and La Terreur, and from June to the July 1794, Le Grand Terreur, the quote, Great Terror. A revised version of the book called The Great Terror, A Reassessment was printed in 1990 after Conquest was able to amend the text, having consulted the opened Soviet archives. The book was funded and widely disseminated by Information Research Department, who also published Orwell's list collected by Conquest Secretary Celia Kirwan. One of the first books by a Western writer to discuss the Great Purge in the Soviet Union, it was based mainly on information which had been made public either officially by individuals during the Khrushchev thaw in the period of 1956 to 1964, and on an analysis of official documents such as the Soviet census. It also drew on accounts by Russian and Ukrainian emigres and exiles dating back to the 1930s. The book was well received in the popular press, but its estimates started a debate among historians. Conquest defended his higher estimates of 20 million, which are supported by some historians and other authors in the popular press, while other historians said that even his reassessments were still too high and are considerably less than originally thought. Wikipedia says George Robert Ackworth Conquest lived from 1917 to 2015 and was a British and American historian, poet, and novelist. Robert Conquest was briefly a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, but later wrote several books against communism. A longtime research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, Conquest was most notable for his works on the Soviet Union. Conquest books include The Great Terror, Stalin's Purges of the 1930s, published in 1968, The Harvest of Sorrow, Soviet Collectivization and the Terror Famine, 1986, and Stalin, Breaker of Nations, published in 1991. He was also author of 2 novels and several collections of poetry. Back to the text. This is still a footnote. The first volume of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago gives some examples of how widely this Article 58 could be stretched, making particular use of A. Vyshinsky's something in Russian. Wikipedia says Andrei Vyshinsky was a Soviet politician, jurist, and diplomat. Andrei Vyshinsky is best known as state prosecutor of Joseph Stalin's Moscow trials and in the Nuremberg trials. Andrei Vyshinsky was the Soviet foreign minister from 1949 to 1953 after having served as deputy foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov since 1940. He also headed the Institute of State and Law in the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union. Back to the text, end footnote. The character of the anti-peasant war of the 1932 to 34 famine, that anti-peasant war is in italics, so the character of the anti-peasant war of the 1932 to 34 famine was also shown in an exchange of letters between Stalin and Soviet writer Sholokov. I don't know who this is referring to. Is this the right person? Okay. Yeah, I think this is the right person. Mikhail Sholokhov lived from 1905 to 1984 and was a Russian novelist and winner of the 1965 Nobel Prize in Literature. Mikhail Sholokhov is known for writing about the life and fate of Don Cossacks during the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, and the period of collectivization, primarily in his most famous novel And Quiet Flows the Dawn. Back to the text. On the 16th of April 1933, the latter, Sholokhov, wrote to Stalin to protest against the revolting acts committed against peasants and which he believed, parenthesis, or pretended to believe, in parenthesis, were the results of, quote, local excesses, end quote, which had the result of depriving the peasants of grain and led to mass arrests, including the arrests of party members. In his reply, only published 30 years later, Stalin admitted that, quote, excesses might have been perpetrated, but Stalin claimed that these excesses were only of minor importance because Stalin said, quote, the honorable cultivators of your region, and not only of your region, indulged in sabotage and were determined to deprive the workers and the Red Army of grain. Excuse me. The fact that this sabotage was silent and apparently without violence, parenthesis, blood was not shed, in parenthesis, does not obscure the fact that the honorable cultivators were carrying on a, quote, silent war against Soviet power, end quote. Stalin. Footnote. There are traces of other protests apart from Sholokhov's. For example, there was a protest by Art Terekov, secretary of the Ukrainian Party's Central Committee. Yeah, I can't find anything for this person. This piece by R. Terekov describes the dramatic rural situation in that republic. In Pravda of May 26, 1946, the addressee of this letter, Stalin, describes its author as a storyteller. Writers and eyewitnesses have described the situation of deserted villages, with houses having their windows boarded up and material abandoned in the fields. See the unpublished memoirs of A.E. Kostorin, quoted by Roy Medvedev in his Let History Judge. Wikipedia says Alexei Kostorin lived from 1896 to 1968 and was a Soviet writer and Bolshevik Gulag survivor and a prominent campaign for civil rights in the USSR in the 1950s and 1960s. End footnote. In a conversation between Stalin and Churchill, recounted by the latter in his memoirs, the General Secretary compared the struggle for, quote, collectivization with the most terrible experiences of the war against Nazi Germany. Footnote. See Winston Churchill, The Second World War, Volume 4. The conversation went as follows. Quote, ... Have the stresses of this war been as bad to you personally as carrying through the policy of the collective farms? End quote. Oh no, Stalin said. The collective farm policy was a terrible struggle. You were not dealing with a few score thousands of aristocrats or big landowners, but with millions of small men. 10 millions, Stalin said, holding up his hands. It was fearful. 4 years it lasted. End quote. That's from Churchill's memoirs. Second World War book. Wikipedia says the Second World War is a history of the period from the end of the First World War to July 1945, written by Winston Churchill. Churchill labeled the, quote, moral of the work, end quote, as follows. In war, resolution; in defeat, defiance; in victory, magnanimity; in peace, goodwill. These had been the words which Churchill had suggested for the First World War memorial for a French municipality. Churchill's suggestion had not been accepted on that occasion. Churchill compiled the work with a team of assistants who, using both his own notes and privileged access to official documents, while still serving as leader of the opposition. The text was vetted by the cabinet secretary. Churchill was largely fair in his treatment, but wrote the history from his personal point of view. Churchill was unable to reveal all the facts, as some, such as the use of ultra-electronic intelligence, had to remain secret. From a historical point of view, the book is therefore an incomplete memoir by a leading participant in the direction of the war. The book was a major commercial success in Britain and the United States. The first edition appeared in 6 volumes. Later editions appeared in 12 and 4 volumes. And furthermore, there is a single volume abridged version. Back to the text and footnote. Toward the end of 1933, the, quote, pressure bearing on the peasantry seemed to moderate somewhat, but this did not entail the repeal of the deportation measures previously decided. In 1934, repression continued to destroy Soviet peasants, including the kolkhozniks. The number of peasant victims of this repression is impossible to calculate precisely, but some idea of the scale can be obtained. Thus, the Soviet demographer, Urlanis, utilizing the official statistics of the second 5-year plan, was led to the admission that several million people died in 1933. It seems to be a Boris Urlanis. Anyway, footnote. BC Urlanis, something in Russian. And footnote. The savage increase of mortality in 1932 to 34 was due to both famine among peasants who stayed in their original region and to the excess mortality which struck populations deported to the camps or to inhospitable regions, populations which were mainly rural. In general, it is estimated, for the period covering the end of the first 5-year plan and the beginning of the second, that about 10 million peasants were deported. These figures cannot be added to those preceding, because part of those who died in deportation were doubtless included in the number of victims implicitly suggested by Urlanis, or at least up to 1933. After 1932, a considerable number, impossible to calculate, of deported peasants died from privation. The profound, quote, logic of the historical process which has just been described in broad outline is a class logic, a logic of capitalist revolution. The latter destroyed right down to the roots the gains of the peasant revolution of 1917. Its agents were the cadres of the party and of the state apparatus. The triumph of the capitalist revolution demanded the extinction of peasants working as small independent producers. It relates to what Marx had already written about, quote, primitive accumulation, which simply was repeated here just as it was repeated in colonial countries when the bourgeois imperialists proceeded to the expropriation of the villagers in favor of the, quote, development of capitalism. Quote, its annihilation, the transformation of the individualized and scattered means of production into socially concentrated means of production, of the pygmy property of the many into the huge property of the few, the expropriation of the great masses of the people from the soil, from the means of subsistence, and from the means of labor, this fearful and painful expropriation of the mass of the people forms the prelude to the history of capital. It comprises a series of forcible methods, ... End quote. Karl Marx, Capital. The expropriation of the peasants which took place in the USSR through the 1930s had obviously nothing in common, despite all the talk about, quote, socialist construction, with what Marx called the, quote, negation of private capitalist property, end quote, which according to Marx was to reestablish not private property, but individual property based on the acquisitions of the capitalist era, cooperation, and the communal possession of land and the means of production produced by work itself. I'm going to repeat that last sentence because there's a lot of italics. The expropriation of the peasants which took place in the USSR through the 1930s had obviously nothing in common, despite all the talk about, quote, socialist construction, with what Marx called the, quote, negation of private capitalist property, end quote, which according to him was to reestablish not private property, but individual property based on the acquisitions of the capitalist era, cooperation, and the communal possession of land and the means of production produced by work itself. That's the end of this chapter. Thank you so much for listening.